Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us and welcome. We are really looking forward to this Q&A discussion on the powerful film Santiago Rising. We are very excited to have the filmmaker here, Nick MacWilliam, and Professor Juliet Lynd. And before I introduce them, I'm Bill Lyons from the President of the Ohio Community Rights Network. And we are co-sponsoring this Empowering Community film series with Simply Living, and we have Chuck Lynn of Simply Living here. And last year, we had a democracy film series, and we showed 4 films. So we plan on other films this year. We've, I think, selected our second film, but we haven't set a date yet. So do stay in contact, and we will give you details of when that will be and what that will be coming up here. So, if you didn't get a chance to donate, I know that I've heard that the donation link for some of the things was not working. Please, I think in the chat, the donate link will be put in there. So if you didn't get a chance, this does cost us some money. We're grassroots organizations, both Simply Living and the Ohio Community Rights Network. And also for support of our work there. So please consider, if you didn't get a chance, to donate to our series and our causes. So first, let me, I'll read, if Chuck, you don't mind, from Simply Living's website about the what Simply Living's mission is about. It's a community organization that celebrates and connects people to learning opportunities that promote community sustainability, environmental awareness, and our local economy through educational outreach and partnerships within our community. Okay, and like I said, I'm with the Ohio Community Rights Network, and we are a network of communities throughout Ohio, which have the goals to facilitate the building of more just and sustainable communities throughout Ohio through collaboration, to expand the understanding of local self-governance, what we call community rights also, and rights of nature, and to work toward the realization of these. Okay, and so Nick MacWilliam is a British filmmaker and journalist. He lived in Chile from 2010 to 2014. He's written extensively on Latin American politics and culture for various media, including Jacobin in these times, Counterpunch, NACLA, Red Pepper, and more. He's a co-editor of Alborada, an independent media platform focused on Latin America. And we have with us Juliet Lynd, Associate Professor of Spanish and Latin American Studies and Interim Chair of the Department of Languages, Literature, and Culture at Illinois State University. Her scholarship and teaching are centered on the intersections of culture, art, and politics in Latin America, including poetry, narrative, and the visual and performing arts. She's published numerous articles on literature and ideology throughout Chile's experience of revolution, dictatorship, and democracy from the 60s through the present. She's currently writing a book on poet, artist, performer Cecilia Vicuña's work in Chile in the 60s, 1960s and early 70s, tracing its legacy through the popular unity government of Salvador Allende from 1970 to 73, and the resistance to the brutal reactionary military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet from 73 to 90, and the comprised transition to democracy in the 1990s through to the social explosion, as it's called, of 2019 here. Okay, so with that introduction, I'd like to start with Nick. Can you tell us about your connections to Chile, how it came about? I know you lived there for several years, and how this film came about.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Julie. Really nice to be here. Thanks to everyone at the Ohio Community Rights Network. I'm British, and I kind of made this film. I just basically decided to do it on my own. I had didn't really have any backing or anything. So for me, it's kind of it makes me very happy to know that my film is now reaching into, you know, other countries and other parts of the world, because I basically wanted to make this film because I felt we had a lot to learn from Chile in places like Britain, where I'm from, and, you know, other countries under very kind of authoritarian capitalist systems with high levels of inequality. And I think the film has resonated with people who've seen it in other parts of the world, because a lot of us keep living under this system. And we've seen in Chile the incredible grassroots movement that people came together to build in opposition to that. So yeah, no, so really thanks for the invite. So my connection to Chile is kind of almost by accident. You know, I moved there in 2010, as you said, sort of randomly. I'd been living in Spain for a bit. I wanted to keep learning Spanish, keep living abroad, keep exploring a stage of my life where I was younger. And I kind of felt, you know, I had the opportunity to do it. So I went there. And, you know, I knew about the history of Pinochet, Allende. I knew Chile was regarded as the neoliberal laboratory. I mainly learned this from reading The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein and a few documentaries I'd seen. So, you know, I was kind of prepared for some of that. But when I got there, you know, I was not prepared or anticipating the kind of ongoing impact that the dictatorship was still having on daily life in Chile. I moved there in 2010. The dictatorship ended in 1990. So this is 20 years later. Now, I'm referring to things like, you know, the public education system, the public health system, pensions, water access, natural resources, all of which had been massively privatized. There's very little state services in Chile. You know, as the film talks about, and if you know, all throughout that stage of history, everything has become a commodity to become marketized, profiteered upon, and so on. So I got there and I began to notice how this was happening. One of the few things we still have in Britain, although we're a very neoliberal economy, we still have a free health service. So going to having to pay for healthcare, and I think you guys have it even worse, which, you know, for us is a difficult thing to understand, although we have all the rest of it, you know, the privatization and that. So there was that aspect of it, and kind of living under the neoliberal system, I'm sort of used to from home. Well, I'm not sort of used to, I am used to from home. But what I noticed more strongly in Chile was the fact that the architects of that system had built it and had imposed it, not through democratic purposes, not through political policy, but basically through extreme violence. You know, Allende came in 1970, built a system of redistribution, of incorporation of sectors of the population who'd never been invited to participate in politics, and that was brutally suppressed, destroyed, and everyone behind that was murdered, disappeared, forced into exile, tortured, or just intimidated into silence. And that model went on for 20 years. Chile returned to, you know, supposed democracy, the transition to democracy. But the parameters of that democracy were here. You know, they were very small parameters. As I say in the film, it was Pinochet himself who set the terms of the transition to democracy. And all the ruling class by that stage were all in agreement that the economic model and what that entailed, the anti-trade union laws, the anti-environment laws, the low work conditions, which of course is connected to trade unionism, that these were all set to stay. And so Chile returned to elections, let's say returned to elections rather than democracy, once the economic model and political power was safe and secure, and there wasn't going to be another challenge to ruling class interests like there had been under Allende. So I'm there in 2010, I arrive, and I moved into a town, a part of Santiago called Providencia. If anyone's been to Santiago, Providencia is a kind of upmarket part of the city centre. Generally a conservative vote. I mean, I was working around there. I don't go out looking to live. I moved soon after, more downtown to more kind of bohemian area. And just to give an example of this, okay, so the architects, you know, 20 years later, the architects of the brutality and the murder and the repression of so many Chileans had not just disappeared quietly, you know, to just live their lives now of wealth. But the mayor of this area of Santiago, Providencia, was a guy called Christian Labé. And in 1973, in the weeks following the military coup, Labé was a paratrooper in the military. And he was a member in what was called the Caravan of Death, La Caravana de la Muerte. And that was essentially a death squad that traveled up and down Chile in the weeks after the coup, taking people who'd been detained and just executing them on the spot. And a great many people were killed this way. Obviously no trial, anything like that. And this guy participated in that. And he was not, you know, he was now the mayor of one of the wealthier parts of Santiago. And he wasn't a moderate. He was very much that sort of very openly pro-Pinochet, very anti-communist, but vulgar with it as well. You know, you've had a few politicians like that in recent times. But he was very vulgar and abusive in that role. The main avenue that went through Providencia, it was called the Avenida 11 de Septiembre, the 11th of September Avenue, named after the date of the military coup. So these are just examples of how, even symbolically, the coup was still there, and there had been, not only had there been no justice, no accountability, there had not even been a reckoning of taking people away from it. It was so in people's face still, you know, this is what happened. And living there was, I very quickly became aware of the high levels of tension which existed under the surface. And there was a lot of protest, and there were a lot of social movements that were very active, and there was a lot of dissidence, and this was one of the things that really appealed to me and made it such. If you go to Santiago, it's not like a beautiful city on the surface. It's not like going to Buenos Aires or somewhere. But once you get to know it and you realize there's a really strong political culture and artistic culture, which I also show in the film, that was very important to me to show. And that's a tradition going back a long, long time in Chilean politics. But, you know, I very quickly became aware of the student movement, of the Mapuche movement, of the movement for justice for victims of the dictatorship. And, you know, all of these tensions were just underneath the surface, and these would often come out onto the streets. You'd often get protests, and every single time, without fail, you then see the authoritarian model coming into play again, and that's when the repression would come back. And, you know, you very quickly, living there, become aware that the economic model still uses that level, not to the extent of Pinochet. You don't get people getting it. You do maybe, there's been some Mapuche activists and a couple of trade unionists in recent years, but not to the same scale as under Pinochet in terms of people being disappeared and so on. But in terms of its approach to public protest, to public dissent, there's still a very authoritarian model, and that has continued until today. There's still been protests under Boric. Boric has only been in office for a few weeks, but, you know, it's still happening in the last few days. And that policing model really makes you realize that, okay, so this is a system that was put in place through violence, and it's a system which is preserved and maintains its power through that same level of repression and violence. And it has never been a legitimate system in the eyes of a great many people for those very reasons. So living there, I quickly became aware of all that. I lived there in 2011, and I was no longer in Providencia. I was in an area called Barrio Brazil, if you know Santiago, student area, a former communist stronghold, high migration levels, and that was like a protest epicenter. And living there in 2011 at the height of the student movement was a real eye-opener to the strength and the intensity of Chilean protest, and also to the creativity, you know. And of course, I'd listened to Victor Jara, Violeta Parra. I'd watched a lot of documentaries from the 80s. I'd read a lot of books, and I'd become very aware of the creative aspects of protest in Chile. And so I'll just sum up here. So when I went back there in 2019, a few weeks after the explosion occurred, the explosion took place on the 18th of October. I arrived on around the 11th of December. But when I got there, things were building up again because it was the end of the year and people wanted to get things going big by the end of the year. I kind of knew what to expect. The social explosion hadn't surprised me, perhaps to the extent it surprised other people. As I said, you know, I was aware of the tensions beneath the surface of Chilean society. The scale of it was unexpected, but the fact that something had happened, having known the scale and the intensity of Chilean protest, what it can be. But I think the difference this time is you had all these movements come together and they were all suddenly concentrated in opposition to the neoliberal capitalist system. So arriving back there in December 2019, I knew what to expect. I knew I knew that there would be a lot of repression. I knew there would be a lot of creative outburst. And I was also aware from my time living there of the different movements that would be active in the protest. And that's why the first part of the film moves quite quickly, because I tried to get an idea of the different social movements that are involved, and that they might have different, certain different ideas or demands, but essentially they're unified because their fundamental demands is rooted in opposition to the neoliberal model. So, you know, as you mentioned, I've done journalism on Latin America for a long time. So doing this documentary was, I mean, yeah, I couldn't not do it, basically. I had to do it once I was there.
Yeah, I'm so glad you did. And thanks for that great introduction explaining your process. Julie, could you tell us more about your academic interest and your work regarding Chile?
Sure. I think that my trajectory is my relationship with Chile has followed a lot of the same insights that Nick just shared brilliantly. But yeah, I was kind of thinking before this panel that on the flyer, right, it says expert in Chile. It makes me a little uncomfortable. Expert in another country, right? But I have been thinking about Chile a lot for over 25 years now, so I guess I know a few things. My initial understanding of Chile came through working with an advisor. I was doing a PhD in Latin American literature, and my advisor was an exile from Pinochet's regime, right? He'd left Chile in 1974 and had a lot of influence on my thinking and in shaping the kinds of projects that I wanted to look at. I won't go down the whole road of what my dissertation was, but it was asking a lot of those questions about the transition to Chile, transition to democracy in the 90s. As Nick well described it, that sort of very, sort of circumscribed, carefully negotiated post-dictatorial quote unquote democracy, which is a democracy in many ways, but it's one that's been compromised by any number of factors. And I always feel like my relationship with Chile is a little bit odd. I've lived quite a bit in Mexico. My relationship to Latin America is on a personal level closer to Mexico in many ways. So I'd actually written my dissertation before I actually went to Chile. And I remember thinking when I finally went, that I'd written this whole thing on dictatorship and post-dictatorship that was going to feel completely out of date when I got there. And one of the bigger insights that I had was that absolutely not. The whole tension between or the tensions related to the dictatorship were very much the expression that always comes to mind is one that a poet said to me, a flor de piel, right? Like just below the surface of the skin, these tensions were very much present, right? Your interactions with people, you sort of do this kind of careful dance to people trying to figure out how much you know and what side of things you're on in kind of indirect ways. You go into a bookstore, and as a friend of mine described it, wow, it's like there's Santo Pinochet and Santo Allende, right? There's Saint Pinochet and Saint Allende, right? I mean, one section of the bookstore will be all one or the other, or the whole bookstore will be all about Allende, and another bookstore is all much more right wing. So that history very much is there running through everything. I mean, Nick's description of the main avenue called 11 de septiembre, right? The 11th of September, right? There's just these ways in which the dictatorship really savvily, I guess, sort of took power of public spaces. But at the same time, like the memory of the Allende years, right? And the memory of the resistance to the dictatorship is also very much just below the surface, and everything that kind of happens in Chile. And I think that's what we really see in this estallido social, right? This social explosion, as it's been called. And I would like to cite my ideas as a good academic. I can't find the podcast where I heard this little critique of the language used to talk about it. But this person was saying that they were trying to shy away from move away from the term of a social explosion, right? Because it has these connotations of chaos and destruction and violence. And it's like, it's understandable where that language comes from, because it, in some ways and from some perspectives, it felt like it came out of the blue. But like Nick was just saying, there's been this long history of different movements and different protests and different things that have kind of come together, right? And in that sense, when the explosion, the protest sort of came to a head in fall of 2019, the phrase that struck me at the time from the folks that I know in Chile was, Chile despertó, right? Chile has woken up, right? It's just a much more beautiful metaphor, right? That Santiago is waking up. And so I love the title of your documentary, Nick, of Santiago Rising, right? It's a much more kind of positive connotation of something rising up from, a bottom up kind of movement, but also just kind of naming the full city Santiago, because it's not one movement, it's all of these different movements that have come together. One of the main slogans that the young people were yelling in their protests, or people, it's not just young people, right? People of all ages, but it's not just, what was it? No son 30 pesos, son 30 años. It's not just 30 pesos, it's 30 years, right? Because the initial protest there, is this documented in the film, right, was that students had organized a protest to a rate hike in the metro system, right, the subway system. And so kids were jumping over the barriers and refusing to pay the rate hike. And the 30 years always struck me, because they're associating it very much with this compromised democracy, right? It's been 30 years since the dictatorship ended, right? So not fully, they're just locating that 30 years right at that transition moment. And it was such a compromised transition because the political process was so transitioned, but also because the main characteristic of the democracy ever since has been true fidelity to this neoliberal model, right? And so that's what the real critique there is, I think, which is beautiful. But what you have is that long history of awareness. I'll say one more observation about Chile, and then I'll stop talking. But I wanted to make sure that I made this point, because I kept thinking about it throughout the film. Something that struck me years ago watching another similar documentary, and I'm sure Nick is familiar with it, but Battle of Chile, by one of Chile's most well-known documentarians. But one of the volumes of it, well, all 3 volumes of it, have all sorts of interviews with people, and it struck me years ago how coherently people from all walks of life talk about the political model in Chile and the economic model in Chile, right? I mean, from those interviews from the early 70s, it was people very sort of versed in Marxist terminology and able to talk about the kind of economic model that was imposed. And I think we see that in a lot of the conversations that were recorded on the documentary, of people just talking about the neoliberal model, right? I mean, we can talk about neoliberalism and capitalism here, but nobody talks about it as a model as opposed to other models that might be out there, right? And I think Chile, because the neoliberal model was imposed by the Chicago boys and folks from the University of Chicago that, the Chilean economists that trained in the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman, and came in and said, hey, well, we've suspended democracy for a minute, so we don't have to worry about the opposition. We're going to put this model in place and privatize everything and, sell off public services, et cetera. there's a real awareness in Chile, even among people who aren't necessarily activists or considering themselves, part of that kind of activist or political scene, but that sense that neoliberalism is one model, which just in the language allows you to immediately know there might be other models, right?
Yeah.
And that,
yeah.
I think, is something that we don't have here in the United States. I think you would have to build that kind of awareness
Right.
to have the same kind of
Yeah.
explosion,
Well,
as it were, here.
I wanted to remind people that, yeah, please, you can put your questions in the chat. I've got some questions, and I know it's one is mentioned about talking about what has happened since the documentary, and we'll get to that too, and about what's happening with the Constitution and all. But yeah, one thing that you mentioned also, a couple things that I want to touch on is the U.S. has a lot of role in this too, doesn't it, behind Chile's problems, not just being supportive of the coup that took place and put Pinochet in power. And like you said, the neoliberal policies really came from Chicago, Milton Friedman, and some others there that were adopted. And even one, I think, what was his name? Buchanan, is it James McGill Buchanan? He's documented in Democracy in Chains, and sort of being kind of the originator of a lot of these ideas that the Koch brothers look toward to adopt a lot of their neoliberal and libertarian policies and all of that. So I thought, yeah, that's definitely, but the U.S. has definitely plays a strong interest in Chile, and is that a lot because of the mining that is, and the natural resources that Chile has? Nick or Julie?
I can speak to it if you want to.
After you, Julie.
It's definitely the mining interests, but any number of economic interests. Anecdotally, an anecdote that I've heard is that in the early 70s, it's just bigger than that. It's bigger than the mining industry. It's all of the economic powerhouses that were there. And then politically, of course, in the early 70s is, Salvador Allende is socialist, democratically elected to power, right? In 1970, in a very close and contested election. And the United States was never in support of that. And the Cold War ideology at the time, terrified the powers that be, right? Cuba's revolution had just been quite successful and was doing quite well in by the late 60s, and just all sorts of famous quotes from Nixon and Henry Kissinger about how we're not going to let that happen in Chile, right? And so yes, the mining industry, but anecdotally I had heard that the president of the person who was representing Pepsi in Chile knew Nixon, gave him a call and was like, "You got to put an end to this, man. We can't have this situation." And Nixon told Kissinger to get on it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Nick,
Yeah.
with the violence, well, sorry, did you have something else you wanted to say about that? Or?
Just to quickly say, so a couple of just points. So Allende did nationalize US companies.
That's right.
He did give some compensation, but he based his compensation on the tax that they paid, which I think is completely fair enough. And that was the value that the Chilean state gave to those, and they based their compensation on that, which, as you can probably imagine, they hadn't paid a lot of tax. But secondly, it wasn't only an economic issue that the US was so opposed to Allende's government. It was the fact that socialism cannot be seen to be successful in any part of the world. And that, I believe, is still at the roots of US foreign policy, that any alternative to neoliberal capitalism must be crushed, regardless of how it's performing for its own people, even when those models might reach out to the US. For example, Brazil under Lula and Dilma, which still imposed free market economics in certain areas. But under Allende, there was also a concern that Chile could have an impact in Europe and Italy, I believe at the time. The Communist Party in Italy was very strong. And there was real fear, particularly with Nixon and Kissinger, that Chile could, it's not really a domino effect because it's so far away, but that could have an impact on what was taking place in Europe, particularly in Italy, but also in France. You know, the left was strong there, big worker movements with communist influence. And so shutting it down in Chile was vital to sending a message that it needed to be shut down elsewhere as well. And as Juliet mentioned, it's the Cold War paradigm, but that kind of Cold War mentality still exists today, even for small places, you know, which don't have any bearing on the US economy, like Nicaragua or Cuba for that matter. So,
yeah. Okay.
Just jump in. Everything
go
you
ahead.
just said. If I could I just wanted to add that, I mean, like you said, it still bears. This is why we're not seeing anything about what's going on in Chile today in the news, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I mean,
Yeah,
Chile's
I want to
current
see that something's
experiment is
successful.
fascinating.
Yeah. One thing that also impressed me in the film, and maybe it's pretty representative, that the people talk freely about neoliberalism and capitalism, and they seem to understand that, whereas I think my feeling is in the US, a lot of people wouldn't even know what that means. So, yeah, it's just quite, they seem to be more politically aware, and maybe it's because they've had to, or any thoughts on that there about because of what's transpired?
I think generally there's a far higher level of political education in places like Chile, but I also think that is true of other countries in Europe compared with my country. I think political education at grassroots community level is fundamental to building change, which is why I went into a lot of the neighborhoods to show, look, this is what's happening. You know, you want to build change? 1, join a trade union. 2, start talking to your neighbors. You know, start building it in the community. I mean, I was in Buenos Aires 2 days before I arrived in Santiago to film this film. And I was there, I did a report for the Real News Network, if you know them, on the inauguration of the new government in Argentina. And it was a Peronist center-left government. And there was about 2 or 3 million people on the streets of Buenos Aires. And you just get this huge sense of working class consciousness that is a political movement. And working class people in Argentina are aware of their power, you know, and that any kind of governing system really has to take them into account. I don't think we have that, and I don't think the US has that. So, you know, that was another aspect of making this film, because I think we have so much to learn in terms of political education. We don't have community assemblies where I live. We do have the Labour Party, which has what we call wards, which are basically your electoral districts. You have your borough, which is the area you live in, and then your ward, which is your kind of smaller district within that area. And there's, you know, there's a formal official group of the Labour Party, but the Labour Party is constantly being taken over by the interests of big business, as it has been. We had Jeremy Corbyn, if you've been following British politics, who actually gave us hope of change and actually proposed something different. And our entire political media establishment came together to basically do everything possible to shut that project down. They were successful, and now the Labour Party is back under the sort of centre-right, ultra neoliberal, hawkish foreign policy that we had under Tony Blair when the Labour Party led us into the war in Iraq. So, you know, I think political education is fundamental. And as I said, one of the reasons for making this documentary was to show that, look, this is what we need to be doing to build change. We can't wait for change to come from above, which I think is a big mistake in my country. We don't have the political maturity or imagination to think that we can build it from below. You know, we still keep thinking that our political leaders need to do it, and we have to elect them, and then they will do it. But they're not going to represent us. They don't represent our interests, and they never will. And when they do happen, we see, well, when there is a possibility that will happen, we see basically the establishment reaction. And in terms of that as well, the expression "Chile's woken up," "Chile despertó," reflects that. It reflects this class-based political consciousness that people are now experiencing, and that's essentially what that expression refers to.
Yeah. What you say fits perfectly with US. Yes, Jack.
Yeah, I wanted to comment, I'm representing Simply Living, and people may be wondering what's that got to do with what we're talking about. Well, we're very much advocates for localization, as Nick was saying. That, the bottom up change is critical. And we associate neoliberalism with the global consumer culture and economy. Okay, so simple livers are saying, hey, this is crazy. We're living with all this stuff. It's killing the planet, et cetera. So we associate globalization as an unnecessary evil, in the sense that it's pushing back against the localization efforts, like in local food. And you'll see that even the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island that just voted for a union, done entirely independently of the union movement. I'm all for the union movement. I'm just saying it's people scrapping at the bottom level to say, let's just do this. And I think that's a critical thing that we can expect more of in the United States as people become aware. For example, our Jeremy Corbyn was Bernie Sanders, and same pattern happened. The institutional whatever, the Democratic establishment that's basically beholden to corporate interests and globalization came down to make sure that he didn't have any, but he still has some influence. And he's holding hearings right now on the need for the right for healthcare. And there's still a lot of people who are aware under the surface of the importance of radically transitioning to respond to climate change, to deal with the energy. So there's a lot going on, again, under the surface, not at the level, because we have very limited political education, but kind of at the eat local, bank local, a lot of this emphasis on local economy, locally owned businesses, and supporting local resonates with most Americans. And I think that's an avenue that we may be able to wedge in there with this bottom-up change movement.
Yeah, I would say that, just to add to that, our organization, community rights, part of the community rights movement, and rights of nature, we'll get to too, that's in the Constitution, but we believe in that communities should have the right to decide what they want in their communities, as long as it's not taking away rights from individuals. And they can be test grounds for, like Chuck mentioned, a lot of great ideas, but a lot of it's being suppressed with state preemption and things like that. So, but we are for democratic local self-governance there. And so that's what, and people should have the right to keep out those harmful things that they feel like environmental pollution and that are being imposed, and Chile, of course, is experiencing that. I want to, another thing that struck me about the film that demonstrates is how inclusive it was, that people of age, of background, gender, occupation, indigenous, and how they, how they use public space and all that, and then also the carnival-like feeling of it, that it's like the revolution has to be joyous, right? The dancing, the music, the arts. Yeah, and I imagine that has played a role in sustaining the protest. I'd just like to hear a few comments on that from Nick or Julie.
Okay, so yeah, as I said, when I went there to film, I was aware of the creative aspects that would be at the heart of the protest. It's not only in Chile, of course, I'm sure if you go to other parts of the world where they have protests, you will always see art, music, and other forms of creative expression. Now, I was very, very keen to document that, because one of the things that most kind of made me enamored by living in Chile on the protests I went on and just being in the city. But there's a long tradition of that, which I've already referred to, and that the culture of or creativity in protest in Chile and in politics is not only an aesthetic, it has a core political, strategical purpose. If you go back to the 1950s, the 1960s, Allende, people forget, but Allende was elected the 4th time he stood for president. He had run and lost on 3 previous occasions. On each occasion, he would not get the media to promote his message, and that's quite clearly because his message was fundamentally in opposition to their interests, because they were a very corporate establishment media. So, you know, how did you get these messages out, you know, and going into 1970, and then when Allende was in government as well, how do you get his messages out if the media, the private media, won't carry it? Particularly in a country like Chile in this time, when there was a large rural population, there was illiteracy in communities, very few people had televisions, there were a few radios, but there wasn't really access to media in the same way as we understand it today. So music and art and other forms of culture became fundamental to spreading socialist ideas and progressive ideas. There are bands in Chile from the 60s and 70s, Inti Illimani, Quilapayún, who were friends of Victor Jara, and Victor Jara managed them as well. Victor Jara managed Quilapayún. But these weren't just one band. There was multiple incarnations of each band. Why? Because they would go out to the communities and they would play and they would spread these ideas through music. You know, you can only have one band because they needed to be in 10 communities, you know. So you could have different, but they'd be going around under the same name of Inti Illimani, Quilapayún, and they'd be literally be going into the town square and playing music to these people and spreading the message of socialism through these ideas. Also, you know, think about a town, you know, a big wall. You've got a big wall. How many people are going to see that wall on a daily basis in a town where very few have got radio or television? A great many. So you had artists would travel the country painting huge murals about socialism, about the visions for a new society. So, you know, this tradition is based in political strategy as well, and it happens to be very beautiful. And then, of course, under Pinochet, you know, we saw that one of the first things they did, they went into the University of Chile and they destroyed everything that was in the film school. Allende massively promoted film under his government. He promoted the arts, as left-wing governments tend to do. And the Battle of Chile, which everyone must watch, it's a masterpiece, and my film's nowhere near it, but it was an influence on my film. The Battle of Chile, Patricio Guzman, the filmmaker, was actually was commissioned by Allende to document the government, but he ended, like Allende's socialist government, but he ended up documenting the social tensions which built up to the military coup. So the soldiers, 1973, straight after the coup, went into the university and burned or destroyed everything in the film school. There's a clip in my film of them burning books, and of course, most horrifically and famously, they tortured and murdered the folk singer Victor Jara, purely because of the message of his music, because his music elevated the Mapuche people, women, workers, and it spoke of human rights and justice. And, you know, he was killed for that. And other musicians and writers all had to go into exile under Pinochet, and far-right regimes will always target the arts because that is a big, big threat to them. And in the film, just to say this as well, you know, what are people taking out on the streets? We've got our bicycles, we've got our trombones, you know, and then you have the state with its, you know, ultra-militarized water cannons and tear gas and body armor, and the people are confronting them with trumpets and bicycles. And I think that's a really powerful contrast between a people's movement and what is a totally illegitimate, you know, movement to crush that.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. I'd like to get into, since we have roughly maybe 15 minutes left. First of all, I wanted to mention, I saw in the chat that somebody said still would like to see the film. So yes, you do have 24 hours to see the film. You know, if you registered, the link with the password will still be active for 24 hours. So if you didn't get to finish it or you didn't get to watch it, you still get a chance to. So, you know, I imagine you got this link because you probably registered, so that link is still going to work. So, just to kind of summarize, because the question now, what's happened since then? Well, from what I've read, that in October of 2020, there was a plebiscite, and 78% of the people, correct me if I'm wrong with these facts here, this is what I've read, 78% of the people voted for a new constitution. And so let's talk about the process there. I read that there are 155 representatives with the emphasis on gender parity and indigenous representation, including many independent feminists and environmentalists were elected in April of last year, 2021, to rewrite the new Constitution. And also, amazingly, the head of the Constitutional Assembly, I read, is an indigenous Mapuche feminist professor. And the draft is supposed to be completed by June of this year. Of course, things might have changed, and maybe voted on in October of this year. So is there any correction to this or anything else that needs to be added to that you know of, Julie, Renee?
I think that's all right. As we were talking before, prior to everybody coming into the webinar here, without sort of being in the middle of things and paying attention to local news sources every day, it's been hard to follow all the details. The most recent I knew was that the timeline had changed, but I think at some point this year we'll get there'll be a draft of the new Constitution, and it's not entirely clear to me if that needs to go through the Senate first, or if it first goes to a plebiscite for the people to vote on first, to ratify first. But it's been tremendously exciting to see this happen. I mean, it's been a rallying cry of people in all of these different protest movements that Nick has alluded to, the women's movement, feminist movement, this hugely important student movement of, I guess it's now been 10 years or so since that kind of exploded, as it were, onto the scene. Boric's movement, the new president, came from that piece of political activism. But I mean, ever since I've started reading about Chile and learning about Chile, people have been talking about getting rid of the 1980 Constitution. That was one of those pieces of this transition to democracy that was deeply questioned because it was drafted by these neoliberal hacks, right? To assure that the deeply conservative part of Chile would maintain its hold on power, despite opening up the government to elections. And I'm taking the conversation in that direction a little bit. We should definitely come back to what's going on with the Constitution and what's being proposed, what's going to be proposed. But I do think I just was, I was trying to follow a lot of the comments in the chat, that people are sort of duped here, and that we've got, such a strong right-wing media here, and we don't learn about these kinds of history lessons in the schools. And I would say that it's important to acknowledge that another part of Chile is its deeply entrenched, powerful elite right wing. And that we shouldn't forget that, right? I mean, Chile, Allende was elected with just over a third of the vote, right? And that another third of the vote went to an ultra conservative candidate, and it was that center third that swung towards supporting Allende. And by the end of his, he was supposed to be president for longer than 3 years, but 3 years in, that center had swung back towards the right and was also clamoring for a coup, right, and for military intervention into his government, and that's led to the famous coup and Pinochet's dictatorship for so many years. And then the center, of course, drifts back to the left, and we get years of clamoring again for return to democracy. I mean, that again was community organization, right? Really demanding a return, an end to the dictatorship, of saying no, right? There is a long tradition of these plebiscites in Chile, and it was a vote between yes and no, right? And the no won in 1988, famously. It was also, tremendous scenes of jubilation in the streets when that happened. But there is that entrenched right wing, and there is a tremendous effort to distract everybody with consumer culture, and privatization of schools is obviously a deliberate kind of move.
Sounds like here.
People in the dark, but there has also been a tremendous power, I think, in continuing to pass along the memory of what was possible, what was understood as possible during the Allende years. I think that,
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing is the fact that that was not killed in the way that people would like us to believe that it was.
Yeah, I would like to talk a little more about what I read about the Constitution. What's really exciting about it, that the Chileans are tackling a lot of issues that are relevant for us and the rest of the world, besides, you know, economic and environmental justice, what to do about the climate crisis, inequality, and others. And so I'd like to focus on the climate thinking regarding in the new Constitution. And so we know that mining, like I know in the past, like copper has been a big industry, but lithium also. And Chile is one of the biggest producers of lithium in the world. And there's a big demand for it because it's part of batteries for storage for electric cars and other green, quote, I'll say green solutions to the climate crisis. However, the mining of lithium causes a lot of environmental harm, uses a lot of water. They're depleting water that's deep into the Atacama Desert and so forth to make these massive areas to get lithium from. So of course, no one wants to see extraction of more fossil fuels, but what about the extraction of lithium and other metals for the so-called green solutions to this? So I've read that some Chileans saying, well, how much harm can we and should we live with? And what about future generations? These are hard questions. And we can't just think that, oh, well, if we all just go to electric vehicles, you know, and even solar and wind, that's going to solve everything. It's more complex than that. So I read that they have put the rights of nature, which is one of our issues, into their constitution, and ecocide even. And if it's approved by the people, they'd be the second nation behind Ecuador to put rights of nature in their constitution there as a protection and some balance to these forces here. And also that they're considering that what voice should local communities have. That hits right at our issue too, about local communities should have over mining and destruction. Should it all, you know, should the state just be able to dictate everything there? So it seems very exciting what's coming about, and a lot of examples for the world. So just I'd like to hear your thoughts on any of this here. Either one of you.
Okay, I'll just be brief on this. So obviously Chile's main exports is copper, but also I think it's the world's largest copper exporter, and I think the world's second largest lithium exporter.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think Australia's highest. I think. Yeah.
Oh, is it? Okay, and Bolivia is also very high. And lithium is often cited as the main factor in the 2019 coup in Bolivia. But yeah, that's a different story. I mean, obviously it's difficult for governments in the global south that still have like a resource extraction based economy because they need to develop, they need to invest in their own societies. And, you know, if they have, if what they need to do that is in the ground, then what are they supposed to do? You know, Ecuador has a real dilemma because under Correa, for example, Correa wanted to extract oil, or well, you know, oil was fundamental to developing the economy, to investing in society, to building equality, economic equality. But it was in kind of pristine forests. So Ecuador appealed to the world and said, look, you know, this forest is not only for the benefit of Ecuador, it's for the benefit of all of us. We need you to help us to finance us. And that funding, which I think was quite reasonable to request, never came. So, you know, and Bolivia's had similar issues. You know, how do you balance that? The needs of indigenous communities who live in environmental regions, you know, like natural regions, kind of relatively unspoiled. And how do you balance that with the needs of development and society? So it's a very, very tricky thing. I don't think there is a clear kind of answer to that because, you know, the two are not entirely compatible. But what we do know is that building the environmental economy, the green economy, is not a national thing. It has to be an international, global project, and that, you know, nationalism is really harmful to our future, not only in that it fuels conflict, but it also prevents us from working alongside each other. You know, the EU, China, and the US, the kind of biggest economies in the world, should be working together to develop a global transition away from that. But as we can see clearly, they're all in arch competition, and that's going to that can only have a harmful effect. So I'm very sympathetic to these governments on, you know, their needs to do that, and I think it needs a new approach, basically, you know, everywhere. And again, the grassroots is going to be fundamental to channeling that.
Yeah, I think that just one quick comment is another thing that's just not really talked about is we have to look at designing things where we need less energy.
Yeah,
and I think live simply.
Yeah,
and that's what Simply Living, one of the missions is about. You know, not just replacing and having all the power we want, but thinking about how we live differently and design societies differently, so we don't need so much of these things. I'd like to just, in our few minutes left, just a couple minutes left, to ask this question about what parallels do we see with Chile and the US, and what can the US and the world, for that matter, learn from Chile? As you know, and Chuck, I know, wrote in his email, mentioned that what's happening in Chile might be a harbinger for the future of many other places. They come to grips with the kind of neoliberal economic system, and the effects are getting exacerbated on people's lives, even in the US and like you said, in England there. So I just want to thoughts about what parallels and what we can learn from Chile and what's happening.
After you, Juliet or Chuck.
I have one thing I definitely want to say in response to that question, and also in response to the comment before, and some of the comments are coming up in the chat. I think one of the most exciting things that we're seeing with the constitutional conversation is the presence of Mapuche perspectives coming into that constitution, right? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the push for the environmental organizing and getting that language about protecting the environment into the constitution comes from this long history of Mapuche struggle for autonomy, but also for political autonomy and their community autonomy. That's going to be another big controversial piece of this constitution, is what is their relationship to the state, right? But a lot of the Mapuche activism has come together around opposing the privatization of water and the construction of a hydroelectric dam in the south of Chile. And successfully at one point, at least, unless there's been a reversal on that, but they've really done a tremendous job of articulating a lot of these environmentalist priorities for the nation. And so I think a tremendous lesson that we ought to have is to listen to our indigenous communities, right? Involve our indigenous communities in the process of figuring out what our economic, environmental, and political future looks like.
Yeah, they what is it? The small percent of the indigenous communities around the world kind of are responsible for like more than like 3/4 of biodiversity around the world, and they've learned how to live sustainably with the limited resources and things. So you're right, absolutely. We agree totally with that we have a lot to learn there. So yeah, Chuck, last minute thoughts there, and then we'll wrap up.
Just to reinforce all that's been said, but there was a comment in the chat about the mainstream media that are not covering any of this, and that you don't hear criticisms of neoliberal economies, or you hear discussions about how this failed, but nobody talks about the alternative. And I just would say that Will Perkins asked at the end of his comment that, well, is there any hope, to turn this around? Because we're not aware of this. We have very limited political education, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, we're building systems from the bottom up that are ready to supplant the systems that we have. Now, we're not going to get rid of this global oligarchy right away, but we could do some of the big ones we could do it through another form of economics that I talk about all the time, which is modern monetary theory. Modern money theory basically says that the federal government can use the Federal Reserve to do things like bail out the banks, which they've done with trillions of dollars. And there are issues around this, but basically we could say to Exxon, we could say to Monsanto, you are a corporation that is causing a great deal of harm. You have all kinds of lawsuits against you from your own shareholders. Here's an offer you can't refuse. The shareholders would take a vote, and the federal government could take down one big oligarch at a time. Now it may take some, Wall Street collapsing, more of a recession before we get enough points to do that. But we do have people in Congress like Bernie Sanders, the squad, and people who are recognizing that it's not that we already have lost our democracy to the political oligarchs that are part of the oligarchy that we have. It's a kind of a corporate aristocracy. So the World Health Organization is saying, no, we can't do this ridiculous industrial agriculture and the contained animal feedlot operations anymore. We've got to turn it back to local farmers. That's how you really feed the world. So local food, ready to accept that transition, including many of the big farmers right now. They recognize that they're tired. We just saw an article that the increase in fuel is affecting farmers. They don't recognize that, or fertilizer costs are going way up, and it's screwing them. So what do? We have to recognize that it's only because they can do it. The monopoly capitalists can get enriched, from the drug companies to the, on and on. My point is that underneath the surface, it may not be as obvious and may not have the political education, but we do have the recognition that there are people who are waking up to what's going on in the pollution environment, and the absurdity of not being able to change our own communities or stop fracking from happening in our neighborhood if the state wants that to happen. So people are waking up, and I think that there is a path to the future. I've written an article about it. And anyway, so I think there is grounds for hope, not unreal. A lot of suffering is already happening, and it's going to happen more. But we've got to recognize that, get on board with the fact that we can all participate. One last thing, public banking. North Dakota has operated for 102 years, a public bank in North Dakota. Why did they do it? Because a recession back in the 1910s or late 1910s resulted in the farmers and the businesses couldn't get loans, right? Because nobody would invest in them. So they said, well, we'll do our own credit. Well, for 10 years, the Public Banking Institute has been exploiting that success. The head of the Bank of North Dakota makes speeches all the time, and we're hoping to do one in Ohio at some point, to explain that we can do our own credit. And California, New York, California has already passed legislation to allow any city in California or county or consortium to develop a public bank and basically take credit and quit paying half of their bond issues to the Wall Street folks. Localize the economy, localize everything. End of spiel.
Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, I'm glad we just a few minutes over, but I think that's fine. People are, so I just want to quickly ask Nick, are any more films in the plans or working on here before we conclude?
Not currently, but I do hope to get out to Chile. Obviously, the last 2 years haven't been the easiest
yes,
time to be getting out. It was quite good in the sense that I got back from Santiago at the start of January 2020, and then to not be able to leave the house for most of the next year was quite good for editing. So it was quite beneficial in some ways to getting a film done. I had no life and just could edit. Yeah. But no, I mean, I would like to get out there, especially around the Constitution. The Battle of Chile, keep coming back to it. It's been a big influence on me, especially in my film, where you get the scenes of people sitting around in discussion. That was kind of taken from scenes in the Battle of Chile, which I always found really, really fascinating, and also from Ken Loach, the British filmmaker, did that. So I looked at these films and these filmmakers. I've got a long way to go to match them, but yeah, but I would love to get back out there. I also work on Colombia quite a lot as well, and getting out to Colombia, because Colombia has gone through quite a similar process to Chile. But if neoliberal capitalism if you think it's tough in Chile, like in Colombia, I can't get into it now, but it's just given rise to the most brutal, horrific atrocities. And I work a lot on Colombia, and they had a social explosion last year, just about a year and a half after Chile. And that today, their election is in May, and they're for the first time, the left is in a very strong position. They could quite feasibly elect their first ever leftist government. So it'd be a really, really fascinating time if that happens. And if it did happen, I mean, that's virtually, and if Brazil also moves to the left, which is looking likely later this year, fascinating time to be in Latin America. It's the reason for culturally and politically, it's just inspired me and fascinated me and appalled me as well, because there's a lot of terrible stuff happens. But it's always been a region that's fascinated me. So getting back out there is the first step. And then documenting some more of Chile and hopefully in Colombia as well. But I can't say any more than that for now.
Yeah, I mean, well, we can look for what's happening there with excitement, inspiration, and I think it's that people have to become more aware, politically aware. And I love what you said about sit down, have conversations and organize. That's what we need to learn here. So, well, I want to thank you all for joining us. And I want to especially thank Nick and Jolie. We just and love the film and appreciative of what you've done, and look forward to your future projects. And we'll keep watching what's happening in Chile and maybe Colombia as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
Right.
And if you didn't get a chance to donate, again, you can, there's a link in the chat there. And also you still have, if you didn't get a chance to finish watching the film, you still have 24 hours to watch it there. So thanks so much, and look for our next film that we'll be advertising shortly there. So, okay, folks.
Thanks, Juliet.
Bye for now.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks,
you.
Bill.
Really
Thanks,
wonderful
everyone,
film.
for coming. It was great to meet you all, and see you soon.
Same here.